does success look like for you? Here's how one couple answered that question on a man in the street interview, and I'm wondering if many of us would answer very similarly. What does success look like for you?
Everybody wants a house, it seems like.
House, couple of kids, dog,
car.
A safe neighborhood, right? Good school district. Yeah.
And the opportunity to, if you want to, just to make as much money as possible is part of the American dream.
And
you have the opportunity to do it and the opportunity to not.
If you don't want to.
What do you think? Did you notice a little bit how he kind of caught himself near the end, and he kind of looked at his wife, I guess, and they sort of like checked themselves, like, did we really just say that success is all about earning as much money as you can? Well, only if you want to, you know. But like this couple, do we define success primarily by the externals? You know, those signs of success, a good job, a big paycheck, a dog, right? A large house in a good school district to raise a nice family. Is that your checklist for success? Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of those things, right? Nothing inherently wrong with any of those things. But I think we need a more biblical definition of what success is. And today we are going to sort of refine our understanding of success by continuing to study the story of Joseph. Turn in your Bibles, if you would, to the book of Genesis, to Genesis chapter 40. And I'll remind you that we've been taking some time to explore the life of Joseph in a series called Overcomer. We've been seeing that Joseph had to overcome many things in his life to reach the final destination that God had for him. Some of the things that we've seen so far that he's had to overcome are hardships, disappointments. We've talked about that. And we'll see that there's still more for him to overcome, like guilt, resentment, broken relationships, suffering, and even death. All these things we have to overcome as we experience the path that God has us on toward the final destination. And today, though, we reach a really good point in the story of Joseph. It's a story where he finally makes it. He finally arrives at a place of success. We can even call it worldly success. But today, as we take a closer look at that, we're going to actually ask the question, what is real success? How did Joseph demonstrate that success through all the phases of his life? So let me just think with you a little bit about success. When did Joseph arrive at success? For many of us, we think of him when he is finally given the position of second in command to Pharaoh in Egypt. But there are actually other steps along the way, much earlier, when Joseph actually experienced success. Let me think with you about the steps of success that Joseph experienced. The steps of success. How did his life move toward the final destination that God had for him? Now, here's the problem with one of the definitions of success that we often have. We often think of success as arriving at a specific place. And so for many of us, we would say, well, I'm not successful because I haven't arrived there. And we define success as there, right? Do you have a there in your mind? Maybe it involves the promotion in the job. Maybe it involves all these kinds of external things. But here's what I want to suggest to you today. The story of Joseph reminds us to not discount God's blessing and success that we are experiencing even when you're not where you want to be. There's success along the way. And Joseph's life illustrates that for us. In fact, Joseph's life illustrates for us, as Stephen Covey said, that private victories precede public victories. And there are a number of private victories that Joseph has where almost nobody sees them except for God, who then records them for us in the Scripture, thankfully. But some of these successes that Joseph experienced weren't even known to anybody else. You see, we have to remember that we can't discount God's blessings and the success that we're experiencing right where we are, instead of always thinking about where we want to be. Let me illustrate that for you in the story of Joseph. Think back to the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 39. Now, the story begins when Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, and he arrives at the home of Potiphar. And he's a slave. He's a slave. In fact, it says in Genesis 39, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered in the house of his Egyptian master. He's a slave. And yet, the Bible talks about how the Lord gave him success in everything he did. Now, Joseph was not where he wanted to be, but he was still successful in the Lord's eyes, and even in the eyes of those around him, because as the story continues, he experiences tremendous success. And then we know what happens next. Mrs. Potiphar falsely accuses him, and he gets thrown in jail. And now you think there's no way he can experience any success at this moment, because he is definitely in a place he doesn't want to be. Maybe you're in a place you don't want to be today. And what does it say? The warden there in the prison put Joseph in charge of all of those who were in the prison. The Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. He was a success in prison. Not where he wanted to be, but he was doing what God wanted him to do. And as the story continues, of course, we see that this success, if we can call it that, the Lord calls it, but we have a hard time calling it, this success that he has in prison even continues, because then some of Pharaoh's closest aides are thrown in prison. You know the story of the cupbearer and the baker. And I want you to notice something. When they're thrown in jail, who is put in charge? Who's given a promotion in prison? None other than Joseph. And it says, in the prison, the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended to them. Hey, he's got a promotion. In prison, not at all where he wants to be, but he's given even more responsibility. Sometimes, we want success, but we want it on our terms. We want success over here, but God's saying, I want to give it to you over here. We resist that. We struggle with that. Again, is it about our definition of success? And so he's now a success in prison. Well, as you know, the story goes, as we'll see today in Genesis 41, finally the cupbearer remembers Joseph and the dream that he properly interpreted, and Joseph is summoned before Pharaoh, and then all of his fortunes change. And it's only then that he experiences the success that most of us are longing for. In Genesis 41, verses 39 to 43, it talks about that success this way. Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You will be in charge of my palace. Now he's arrived. He's in the palace. Now he's a success. Except he's been a success all along. He's been a success all through the way. See, here's the problem with many of our definitions. We have a geographic problem with success. We have a hard time acknowledging success in the household of his Egyptian master, because he's a slave. He's not there by his own free will. We have a hard problem talking about Joseph's success in prison, don't we? But it's the same language. It's the same God who's working it all out. Now he's in the palace. And now he's a success. And now everyone knows it. But here's the thing. God knew he was a success long before everyone else knew. What's our definition of success? Joseph's life can teach us an important truth about success. Don't discount God's blessings and the success that you're experiencing, even when you're not where you want to be. But now the story of Joseph takes a great turn as we turn to chapter 41, and we think, Joseph's finally there. He's a success. Now everything is fine. But here's the lesson of Joseph. Even in success, there's challenges. In fact, there are plenty of temptations in success that we have to be aware of as well. Don't forget that worldly success often brings us face to face with some of the greatest temptations of our lives. And if I could summarize it this way, I would say this: not only do we need to learn to overcome hardships and disappointments, we've already seen that a bit, and we'll see some more in the life of Joseph. Not only do we have to learn to overcome the things that don't go our way, we also have to learn to overcome the temptations that often come even with our success. And I want to suggest to you briefly that there are three kinds of temptations that Joseph experienced at his pinnacle of success that we can learn from in his life. The first one is, like Joseph, success can often tempt us to misuse our possessions. The second one is, like Joseph, success can tempt us to misuse our power. And the third one is, like Joseph, our success can tempt us to be misled by our pride. Let me briefly describe each of them. First of all, possessions. And to illustrate that for you, that like Joseph, we have to learn to overcome the temptation of success and how we look at our possessions and how we might misuse our possessions. I want to turn back just briefly to a story that we saw already in Genesis 39. Do you remember the time when Mrs. Potiphar was trying to seduce Joseph? Do you remember what Joseph said as to the reason why he could not succumb to the temptation? In many ways, he had experienced success already, at least as far as a slave goes. In fact, he describes how everything in the household was his, except Potiphar's wife. He understood the boundaries. He understood his place. But I want you to notice this. He describes his possessions as not his own. Notice how he describes his possessions. The things that he had been able to get because of his success in Potiphar's household. How does he describe them? Look at verse 8. Everything he owns, meaning Potiphar, he has entrusted to me. What do you think about your possessions? Those of us who have experienced success, and let's face it, every one of us who lives in America has a measure of success that most of the world would never even dream of. So how do we see our possessions? Do we see them as ours? Or do we see them as entrusted to us by someone, a master? Joseph believed even in that moment that everything he had was not his. It was entrusted to him. And you see, that's one of the temptations of success. We begin to think that our possessions are ours. We begin to hold on to them very tightly, and they begin to distort our perspective and the way that we look at things, and it can be a real problem. Then push ahead to when Joseph appears before Pharaoh, and he's summoned to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, I hear that you can interpret dreams. Would you go ahead and interpret my dreams? And I want you to notice what Joseph says. Look at Genesis 41, verse 16. Joseph has a gift. He's been given a gift. He possesses a very special gift. But I want you to notice that he believes that that gift is not his. It's only been given to him, entrusted to him to use wisely. Notice, when Pharaoh says, can you interpret my dream? I want you to notice what he says in verse 16. Genesis 41, verse 16. I cannot do it. Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Joseph understands that the very gifts he possesses are not his. They've been given to him, entrusted to him to use wisely. So to the extent that God has blessed you with success and you possess things, to the extent that God has blessed you and you possess gifts and talents, do you see them as yours? Or do you see them as God's given to you, entrusted to you to use? Joseph had a perspective on his possessions. It's simply this, that whatever God gives me, I'm going to use, because they're his anyway. How do we see our possessions? It's an important element of how we even view our success. I want you to also notice in verse 38 and 39 That when you begin to think about your success in light of God, when you begin to see your possessions as God's to use for His glory, the people around you begin to notice too. Notice what happens in verse 38. After Joseph properly interprets the dream of Pharaoh, notice what Pharaoh says in verse 38. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all of this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you." The people around us, what do they say about our success? Do they see it as a sign of our greatness? Or do they see it as pointing to the goodness of God in us? How do we view our possessions, our resources, everything that we have? Do we see it as ours or do we see it as God's on loan to us? See, Joseph was able to see that everything he had belonged to God and he was simply loaned it to use it. And that allowed him to overcome the success that he would experience. And so, as he is now elevated to a position of leadership within Egypt, he is given great possessions. Verse 45, Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. At 30 years old, he was given everything. Everything. This would have been a great temptation for just about any 30-year-old in that day, or especially today. But you know what? He was ready to receive these possessions because he knew they weren't his. They were on loan to him to use wisely. You see, he had been prepared through the previous successes to be ready to be a good steward of what God would now give him. By worldly standards, Joseph had now arrived. With the influx of possessions, he had everything. But would those possessions change him? Will Joseph now start defining himself by these possessions? See, he's actually experiencing the most difficult test now. You think the test of being unfairly accused and thrown in prison was bad? Now think about the test he's going to experience as he has everything that a man could ever want. What's he going to do now? Is God still going to be his God? Or is he going to replace his God with a small g God, his possessions? And that's why J. Oswald Sanders says, not every man can carry a full cup. Sudden elevation frequently leads to pride and a fall. The most exacting test of all is to survive prosperity. Survive prosperity. Some of you say, I'd like to try it. But it has its own temptations. And Joseph understands that. And so he has to deal with his possessions. How is he going to view those? And you and I, like Joseph, have to think about that too. There's a second kind of temptation in his success that Joseph experienced. And I would use the word power to describe it. Like Joseph, success can tempt us to misuse our power to ignore or even abuse others. Sadly, we've seen in the news how that is happening all around. So many of these scandals, these sexual abuse scandals, are about people that have misused their power to abuse others. It's terrible, it's sad, but this is what happens sometimes when people experience power. They don't know how to use the power to help others. They use it to abuse others. And Joseph has tremendous power. Look at what it says about Joseph in verse 40. Pharaoh says to him, "You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders." That's tremendous power. Everyone submits to him. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I thereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift a hand or a foot in all of Egypt. What great power Joseph now had. He had all of the trappings of power. He had the signet ring, which he could use to seal and sign any documents. He had the robes of fine linen. What is so amazing is that his brothers had stripped his previous robe. Do you remember that robe of many colors? Now he has a new robe. But I believe Joseph believed that that robe was given to him by God too. It's a different robe, a different role for a different time, but it's still given to him by God. And I believe he sees that, he understands that, and he was able and ready to use that power that he had been given, not to abuse or misuse people, but to help people. In fact, as the story continues in verse 53, it says, the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. Verse 55, when all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he says. Wow. Do what he says. Do you have a position like that? Do what he says? That's pretty powerful. And he could use that for great good, or he could use that to abuse the people and to help himself at the expense of others. Joseph has a big test now, bigger than even the test in the prison in some ways. And what's interesting is, notice what it says in verse 57. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain. Skip ahead to chapter 42, and guess what? Even Joseph's family will now come to Egypt to buy grain from him. Here's the thing. Now he's facing his biggest test in the next chapter. You'll have to come back next week. He has all of this power. He has all this power at his disposal, and he can decide how he's going to exercise that power in relation to those who hurt him. Now that's going to be a test. Come back next week and you'll see how he handles that. The truth is, success has a way of changing our perspective. If we're not careful, it can change the kind of person that we become. 3 weeks ago, we saw a journeyman quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings lead the most improbable comeback on the final play of the game, leading the Minnesota Vikings to the NFC Championship game. I will add, and I was required by the deacons to say it, especially Brent, that they did not win and the Eagles are now in the Super Bowl. But it was a great come-from-behind win. As the pandemonium broke out on the field, as everyone was delirious over the victory that the Minnesota Vikings had just experienced, Case Keenum was interviewed before millions of viewers. And this is how he summed up his perspective of success. Did you hear it? Here's what he said.
I have no words. You asked me about this moment. What this moment's meant to me is probably going to go down as the third best moment of my life, behind giving my life to Jesus Christ, marrying my wife, and this one's right there close.
Now, it was hard to hear because the fans were going wild. Did you hear what he said? He said, this is probably the third best moment of my life. The first one, giving his life to Jesus Christ. The second one, marrying his wife. This is the third best moment. This journeyman quarterback who before that year had really not been known, had just led his team to the most incredible victory. He had the most success he's ever had in his life as an athlete, and he says it's the third best moment of my life. Why in the world would he say that before millions of people? Because he understood success, and he put it in perspective. He didn't allow his power, the power that he had, to overtake him. He understood that in this moment the most important thing was his faith in his family, and he never forgot it, even as he was tempted to glory in himself in that moment. And that's the perspective that we see that Joseph has. And this is how Joseph overcomes success and the pride that can happen when we're experiencing success. Now, I don't believe that Joseph was interviewed by, the local news. But here's how Joseph expresses his perspective on success. Look, if you would, at Genesis 41, verses 50 to 52. As Joseph rises to power and he's given all this authority, it says in verse 50, before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim and said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. See, like Joseph, success can tempt us to be misled by our pride. We can think that we've arrived because it's up to us. But Joseph understood that to fail to acknowledge God's blessings was the greatest temptation he'd ever face. And he understood that in the end his success was determined by God. And even the very names of his children expressed that belief and that perspective. His first son, Manasseh, told him to never forget that the trouble that he experienced in life was what God used to prepare him for that moment of success. His second son, Ephraim, reminded him that it was God who made him fruitful. It was God from which our success comes. See, Joseph understood that all of the failings and all of the trials that he experienced was preparing him for this moment of success. And he was shaped and he was ready by that. When we think about the life of Joseph, we often think about all of the troubles that he experienced. But Joseph later on in life was able to have a perspective on it all and to say, even to his brothers in Genesis 50, verse 20, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. You see, Joseph was able to understand that all of the failures that he was experiencing when he was not where he wanted to be was preparing him so that when he got to where he wanted to be, he was ready. A.W. Tozer said this, it's doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has hurt him deeply. That's a hard one to swallow. You see, God was preparing Joseph for the success. He was shaping and molding him for the success because God understood that the success that Joseph would experience in many ways would be his greatest challenge. At that moment, now that he has reached the pinnacle, would he still acknowledge his God? And he did. And he was ready to be used by God now to experience some of the greatest trials even more in his life as he faces his family. He was ready for it because God had prepared him. He was ready for success because he was willing to serve God in his failure.